My name is Margaret Turner, a 29-year-old quantum physicist with nothing but a small lab and big dreams. When my breakthrough finally came, my father laughed across our family dinner table. "Your little experiment is worthless," he declared, sliding papers for me to sign away my rights. He never believed a daughter could achieve what brilliant men couldn't. But what he didn't know was that my phone was silently buzzing with news that would change everything. Please let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've ever had someone underestimate your potential. Trust me, what happened next is worth sticking around for. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, into a family where money and business were always the measure of success. If you couldn't turn your time, your skills, or your dreams into a profit, then in my father's eyes, it simply wasn't worth anything. My father, Eric Turner, built his pride with his own hands, or at least, that's how he liked to tell the story. He started with one small bar on the corner of a busy street. Back then, it was just a smoky, dim place where men from nearby factories stopped by after their shifts. He scrubbed the floors himself, poured beers behind the counter, and made sure the music was loud enough to drown out the sound of tired voices. Slowly, the bar grew popular, and before long, he opened a second one, this time fancier, with cocktails and polished wood furniture. A third followed a few years later, with neon lights, loud music, and VIP booths. By the time I was old enough to ride a bike, my father had turned into what he called a local legend. At family gatherings, he never missed a chance to repeat his favorite line, "Alcohol and parties feed the family, and science is a toy for the poor." He said it like it was a law of nature. For him, nothing mattered except the flow of money and how loudly people praised his business. If a person wasn't buying, selling, or entertaining, they were wasting time. My mother, Linda, was different, or maybe I should say she could have been different. Before marrying my father, she had worked at a bank. She told me once that she had loved her job, that she had been good with numbers and liked helping people manage their accounts. But she gave it up after their wedding. I never heard her complain. Instead, she played her role quietly, always smoothing the edges of my father's roughness, always making sure his meals were hot when he came home, and never questioning his decisions. When my father said something cruel or dismissive, she would glance at me with tired eyes, silently asking me not to argue back. Our house reflected my father's view of success. It wasn't the biggest in Omaha, but it had the look he craved, a two-story suburban home with a freshly waxed SUV in the driveway and a neatly trimmed lawn that my father bragged about even though he never touched the mower. He paid a teenager from down the street to do it. Inside, the living room smelled of leather and cigar smoke. The walls were decorated not with family photos, but with framed advertisements from his bars and plaques from local business associations. Even our dinners revolved around business. While other kids at school talked about movies they watched with their families, my dinner table was filled with stories of profits, losses, customer fights, and liquor suppliers. My father would slap the newspaper down on the table, point at some headline about the economy, and announce, "See, that's why you never waste time with books. You need to learn how to make money, not theories." My mother would quietly refill his glass, never interrupting. I often felt like an outsider even in my own family. While my father's eyes lit up when my cousins helped out at his bars, learning how to take orders or stock shelves, he never asked about my school projects. He didn't care about grades unless they could be turned into business skills. When I brought home a certificate for a science fair, he barely looked up from the bills he was counting. "Nice, but can it pay the rent?" he asked. That was his only comment. Looking back, I realize how much my childhood shaped the way I saw myself. I wasn't poor. We always had food on the table, vacations to local resorts, and a house that looked respectable from the outside. But I grew up feeling poor in another way, poor in encouragement, poor in freedom to explore who I really was. Everyone just assumed I would either marry well or eventually join my father's business in some small role, like bookkeeping or event planning. My passion began when I was 11 years old, though I didn't realize then how serious it would become. It started with something small, an old television set that had stopped working. My father wanted to throw it away, but I begged him to leave it in the garage. The heavy box sat there for weeks until one quiet Saturday afternoon I dragged it into my room with a screwdriver and a pile of curiosity. I spent hours taking it apart, studying the dusty circuits and wires. I had no manual, no instructions, just a childish sense of wonder. Piece by piece, I figured out what connected where, and with trembling hands, I assembled a tiny makeshift radio receiver. I still remember the moment when faint static filled the room, followed by the thin crackle of a local station's music. My heart pounded as if I had just touched magic. I ran to show my father, expecting pride, maybe even surprise. Instead, he barely glanced up from his iPhone. "So what?" he scoffed. "You can't feed your family with science. But working in a bar, that's a real job." The words sank like a stone in my chest. For him, my discovery was nothing but a useless trick. But for me, it was the beginning of everything. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to my tiny radio whisper through the static, promising me a different future, even if my family couldn't see it. At school, I tried to hide my obsession. While other girls traded magazines or practiced cheerleading routines, I smuggled wires, batteries, and scraps of aluminum foil into my backpack. I built simple circuits that lit small bulbs, and later, I moved on to model rockets. I'd stand in the schoolyard after hours, watching them shoot up into the sky, even if they only lasted a few seconds before tumbling back to the earth. For me, it wasn't about perfection. It was about the thrill of making something come alive. But at home, my experiments were met with indifference or irritation. My father complained about the mess of wires on my desk, the smell of solder, or the sparks that sometimes startled him when he walked past my door. "A waste of time," he muttered, shaking his head. My mother stayed silent, the way she always did, but I could tell she worried. "Just don't make him angry," she whispered once, while quietly folding my clothes. By high school, I was desperate for something bigger, something that would challenge me more than textbooks and small projects. That was when I discovered the State University's physics lab. At first, it was just curiosity. I'd seen a flyer at the library about open lectures, and one evening I decided to sneak away and attend. I told my parents I was studying late at school, then boarded the city bus with trembling hands and a notebook tucked under my arm. When I walked into that lecture hall, I felt as if I had stepped onto another planet. The air was filled with the quiet hum of projectors and the soft murmur of students scribbling equations I could barely understand. I didn't belong there. I was just a high school kid, but no one seemed to notice. I sat in the back, listening wide-eyed, as the professor spoke about the mysteries of light and energy. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not by anyone in the room, but by the subject itself. Physics didn't care about my father's bars or about money. It was pure, unbending truth. I became addicted. Whenever I could, I lied about staying late for group projects and instead slipped onto that bus to the university. Eventually, I found the courage to approach one of the professors. His name was Robert Stevens, a tall man with silver hair and a kindness in his eyes that reminded me of the teachers who believed in me back in elementary school. He asked why I was there, and I stammered out my interest in science, half expecting him to laugh at me the way my father did. Instead, he leaned forward and said something I will never forget. "You think like a scientist, not a schoolgirl." No one had ever spoken to me like that before. No one had ever suggested that my curiosity was more than just a childish phase. I remember the way my chest tightened, the way my throat burned with the effort not to cry. From that day forward, Professor Stevens let me help around the lab. At first, it was small tasks, washing glass beakers, labeling wires, sweeping floors. But he never treated me as if I didn't belong. Slowly, he gave me more responsibility, preparing simple experiments, assisting graduate students with setting up their demonstrations, and even letting me peer into the electron microscope. Each time, I felt like I was stepping deeper into the universe I had always longed to touch. I hid it all from my family. If my father had known, he would have dragged me home by the arm and forbidden me from ever returning. To him, every hour I spent in that lab was an hour wasted, an hour that could have been used to learn real work. So I built a secret life, balancing the dullness of school and the heaviness of home with the quiet fire of the lab. Sometimes, late at night, I would return home exhausted, my clothes smelling faintly of chemicals. My father would be sitting in his recliner, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching late-night sports. He'd glance at me briefly, then back at the screen. To him, I was invisible. And to me, his dismissal became fuel. The less he cared, the harder I worked. The letter from Caltech arrived in a plain white envelope. I had been waiting for weeks, barely sleeping, checking the mailbox as though my life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. When I tore it open and saw the word congratulations, I could hardly breathe. A full scholarship. A chance to escape Nebraska. A chance to finally be where I belonged. For a few hours, I let myself dream. I imagined the palm trees, the laboratories, the lectures filled with students who lived and breathed science the way I did. I imagined not having to hide my notebooks or pretend that my experiments were just silly hobbies. And finally I saw a path opening in front of me that wasn't mapped out by my father's business. But when I told him, everything shattered. We were sitting at the dinner table, steak, potatoes, a glass of whiskey at his right hand. My mother smiled faintly when I announced the news, but she quickly lowered her eyes, as though she already knew what was coming. My father put down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and stared at me as if I had just confessed to a crime. Caltech, he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You're telling me you're going to waste your life in California instead of doing something useful? I tried to explain about the scholarship, about how rare and competitive it was, but he cut me off with a bark of laughter. Scientists live on grants, Margaret. Grants? Do you know what that means? Begging for scraps of money year after year, just to keep the lights on. But a bar, he pointed his fork at me like a weapon, a bar is real money. Real customers. Real success. And I built this empire so you wouldn't have to struggle. The idea that I might want something else wasn't just disappointing to him, it was betrayal. That night turned into a shouting match I'll never forget. He slammed his fist on the table, the silverware rattling against the plates. You'll regret this. Mark my words, Margaret, you'll come crawling back when you realize there's no future in chasing stars and theories. And don't expect me to pay a dime when you fail. I looked at my mother, hoping she might intervene, but she just sat silently, twisting her napkin in her hands. Her loyalty was always to him, never to me. But I left anyway. The goodbye was bitter. He didn't hug me, didn't wish me luck. He just stood on the porch with his arms crossed, watching as I loaded my suitcase into the back of an old bus heading west. My mother slipped a $20 bill into my hand at the last moment, whispering for food before stepping back into the shadow of the house. That was it. That was the send-off I received for the biggest decision of my life. California was a shock to my system in every way. The campus was beautiful, but I felt out of place among students who seemed to know everything already. They spoke casually about advanced concepts I had only glimpsed in textbooks. Some of them had grown up with private tutors, summer research programs, and parents who proudly bragged about their children's achievements. I had none of that. I had a scholarship, a suitcase, and the gnawing fear that my father was right, that I didn't belong here, that I would fail. Money was always tight. The scholarship covered tuition, but not everything else. I rented a small room in a crumbling house a few miles from campus. The walls were thin, the bathroom down the hall was shared with 3 strangers, and the kitchen smelled faintly of mildew. To pay for food and books, I worked part-time as a tutor for local high school students. The pay was modest, but every dollar mattered. Some nights, after finishing hours of problem sets and lab reports, I would bike across town to sit with a teenager struggling with algebra. I'd explain equations with patience, even when exhaustion pressed down on me so hard I could barely keep my eyes open. Then I'd return to my little room, heat a can of soup on a single burner, and collapse into bed, knowing I had to wake up early for class. It was harder than anything I had ever done. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when I wondered if my father's words were echoing in my failures. But every time I stumbled, I remembered the sound of his laughter when I told him about Caltech. That memory became fuel. If I succeeded, it would prove that I wasn't the fool he thought I was. So I learned to live with less. I wore thrift store clothes, rode a beat-up bike instead of buying a bus pass, and stretched every dollar until it screamed. I memorized which grocery stores had the cheapest bread and which ones offered discounts after 9 o'clock at night. While my classmates went out for dinners or trips, I stayed in, hunched over my desk, determined not to waste the opportunity one had fought for. Quantum communications became more than a field of study for me. It became my lifeline, the thing that gave every sacrifice meaning. By the time most of my classmates were still juggling electives and debating which labs to join, I had already thrown myself headfirst into long nights under fluorescent lights, surrounded by humming machines and tangled wires. I wasn't the smartest student at Caltech, not at first, but I was the one who refused to leave the lab when others gave up. I remember how it began. I had stumbled across a research paper late one night while scrolling through the university's database. It described the fragility of quantum entanglement, how maintaining the delicate link between particles required extreme, freezing conditions. The problem fascinated me. It wasn't just theoretical, it was a challenge. Everyone said entanglement at room temperature was impossible, like trying to keep ice cubes solid under the desert sun. But that word, impossible, only fueled me. From that point on, I lived in the lab. My small rented room became little more than a place to shower and sleep a few hours. The real heartbeat of my life was the whirring of cryostats, the glow of computer screens, and the endless scribbles on whiteboards covered in equations that only a handful of people in the world could read. Professor Stevens became more than just a mentor. He never mocked my ambition, never told me I was reaching too far. Instead, he encouraged me to try. If you want to spend all night chasing this, then do it, he told me once, sliding me an extra coffee across the lab bench. Science doesn't happen from 9 to 5. It happens when someone refuses to stop. The first years were full of failure. Circuits overheated, delicate equipment broke, and funding for parts always seemed to run dry. I'd spend hours setting up an experiment, only to watch the data collapse into meaningless noise. There were nights when I cried in the supply closet, exhausted and humiliated. But I always came back. Failure became my teacher, sharpening my instincts, teaching me to see patterns hidden in the chaos. And then, one night, everything shifted. I had been working with a modified system, tweaking settings in ways that most researchers would have dismissed as futile. The lab was empty except for the hum of machines and the scratch of my pen as I recorded numbers. Suddenly, the readings stabilized. At first, I thought it was a fluke, a lucky spike that would vanish within seconds. But the entangled particles held steady, even as I tested again and again. My hands shook as I realized what was happening. I had done it. I had stabilized quantum entanglement at normal, everyday room temperature. I remember standing there in stunned silence, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. It felt surreal, like catching lightning in a bottle. I called Professor Stevens, barely able to form words. He rushed into the lab, still wearing his coat, and when he saw the data, he froze. "Margaret," he whispered, his eyes flicking from the monitor to me. Then, louder, "Do you even realize that this could change everything? From medicine to national defense, everything." Hearing him say that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't just solving a puzzle for myself anymore. This was bigger than me, bigger than the lab. The implications were enormous. A true quantum internet, communication channels so secure they could never be hacked, medical data transmissions that couldn't be intercepted, defense systems immune to espionage. The possibilities spiraled in every direction, dizzying and terrifying. The following days were a blur. The university administration was notified immediately. I was summoned to meetings where deans and lawyers crowded into rooms, peppering me with questions. They wanted every detail, every step documented, every calculation double-checked. For once, I wasn't the girl struggling to prove she belonged. I was the one holding something they all wanted. The legal department began drafting patent documents almost immediately. They insisted I provide exhaustive notes, lab journals, raw data, receipts for equipment purchases. I handed everything over, grateful that I had been meticulous about record-keeping from the start. It wasn't just about credit, it was about protection. I knew instinctively that if I didn't establish my claim now, someone else would. Professor Stevens stood by me through all of it. He refused to let anyone downplay my role. When a senior faculty member casually suggested that maybe the discovery should be attributed to the lab as a whole, Stevens cut him off. No, this was Margaret's breakthrough. Without her, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. His words became a real shield around me. For the first time, I felt truly respected, not just tolerated. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I walked across campus, I imagined whispers following me. Every time I sat in a meeting, I wondered who might try to twist the story, to reshape it in their favor. My father's voice echoed in my head: science is a toy for the poor, but now the toy had teeth. Now the toy was worth billions. The university pressed forward with patents, negotiations, and meetings I could barely keep up with. But underneath the chaos, one truth pulsed steady in my chest. I had crossed a threshold. There was no going back to being the invisible girl from Omaha, the one ignored at family dinners. My work had given me power, and the world was beginning to notice. But then, one day, I packed a suitcase not for a conference, not for a lab trip, but to go back home to Omaha. My hands trembled as I slid the folder into my bag, the folder filled with graphs, diagrams, and printed data from the experiments that had shaken the scientific community. It felt almost childish, like bringing home a drawing from kindergarten for my parents to stick on the fridge. But that was exactly what I craved: recognition. A spark of pride in my father's eyes, some warmth in his voice. The drive from the airport to my parents' house felt surreal. Nebraska hadn't changed much, flat fields stretching out endlessly, the same old gas stations, the same quiet streets. I arrived just before dinner. The house looked the same as when I left. The manicured lawn trimmed by the neighborhood kid, the SUV gleaming in the driveway, the faint smell of cigar smoke already drifting out the open window of the living room. My father's empire, as he liked to call it, hadn't changed. Inside, the dining room table was set in its usual extravagant way. My mother had laid out her best dishes: polished silver, heavy plates, linen napkins folded into neat triangles. In the center sat a basket of freshly baked bread, still steaming, and platters of steak resting in pools of their own juices. The table itself always felt less like a place to eat and more like a stage where my father performed his role as the successful patriarch. I kissed my mother on the cheek as she fussed over the food. "You've lost weight," she murmured, her eyes flicking over me. It wasn't a compliment, more an observation she didn't know how to soften. My younger brother Chris was already seated, scrolling on his phone, smirking when he saw me. "Well, look who finally remembered they have a family," he muttered. I ignored it. Tonight, I didn't want to fight. Tonight, I wanted to share something important. My father entered last, as always, with his whiskey glass in hand. He lowered himself into the head chair with the heavy presence of a man who expected the world to revolve around him. "So," he said, before even picking up his fork, "what brings you back, Margaret? Business failing? Need money?" I swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Actually, I came to share some good news." I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, revealing neatly organized charts, equations, and schematics. "I've been working on quantum communications," I began carefully, trying to keep my tone steady. "It's about using quantum entanglement for secure channels of information. And a few months ago, I made a breakthrough. I managed to stabilize entanglement at room temperature. That means..." But my father's eyes had already drifted back to his plate. He sliced his steak with slow precision, chewing noisily as if my words were background noise. My mother nodded politely, pretending to listen, though I could tell she barely understood what I was saying. Chris smirked again, as though waiting for me to trip over my own words. Still, I pressed on. I described the potential of a quantum internet, of communication lines that couldn't be hacked, of how the university was already filing patents. "It could change everything," I said softly, my voice almost pleading. "Medicine, defense, even finance. It's important." I glanced up, searching desperately for some flicker of pride in my father's face. Instead, he looked bored. He took another sip of whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass. "Quantum what?" he muttered. Margaret, speak English. All I hear is you wasting time again. The words cut deeper than I expected. After everything I had endured, the sleepless nights, the failures, the endless hours of work, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would see me differently now. But his eyes stayed dull, fixed on his plate, as though my achievement was nothing more than background chatter. Chris leaned back in his chair, grinning. So, basically, you invented a fancy walkie-talkie? Cool. He laughed at his own joke, and my father chuckled faintly, as though the mockery made more sense than my research. I tried to recover, tried to explain more simply, but my voice cracked. No, it's not just a project. This could be worth billions one day, maybe. That got his attention for a split second. His eyes flickered, sharp and calculating. But just as quickly, he leaned back, waving his hand dismissively. Scientists always talk big. Grants, projects, patents. But in the end, it's all theory. You can't build a family business on theory. The silence that followed was suffocating. My bread roll sat untouched on the plate in front of me. I had imagined this moment so differently. My father leaning forward with curiosity, my mother smiling proudly, my brother, even just once, looking at me without mockery. Instead, the only sound was the scrape of silverware against porcelain and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I pushed the folder closer to him, my last attempt. Dad, just look at this. The data, the graphs. He didn't even glance down. Eat your dinner, Margaret. Don't ruin the meal with nonsense. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disbelief, it was indifference. And indifference was something I could never fight against. That night, as I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by old posters and faded furniture, I stared at the folder lying on my lap. The same folder that had excited professors, startled scientists, and sent lawyers rushing to file patents meant absolutely nothing here. But the next morning changed everything. My mother passing dishes as if carbohydrates could smooth over the tension. Chris drummed his fingers on the table. Suddenly, Father entered the kitchen, put his phone on the table and said, Margaret, we're selling your research. Because now it's worth $1.5 billion. For a heartbeat, I couldn't process the words. The room kept moving. The ceiling fan hummed. The ice cubes clicked inside the glass. Chris's phone lit with a notification. We're selling. I heard myself repeat, barely a whisper. We're selling. He didn't give me time to ask how he knew about the patents, or the experiments, or the meetings with the university lawyers. He reached under his chair, lifted a leather briefcase I hadn't noticed, and pulled out a thick folder with tabs and clipped pages. He laid it next to my open graphs with the measured satisfaction of a man presenting the check at the end of a golf tournament. There, he said, tapping the cover. Contract to transfer your development to Turner's Family Holdings. The name hit me like cold water. My development. Transferred. To his company. My eyes ran over the top page, registering bold font, our surname in caps, legal phrases that swarmed like locusts, assignment of rights, perpetual, royalty-bearing, to whom, irrevocable, work product, know-how. A notary stamp flashed in the corner like a bruise. Wait, I don't understand, I said, though I did. I understood far too well. You will, he replied. You will when the money lands. Chris leaned forward, finally interested. Show her the org chart, he suggested, grinning. It's pretty sweet. My father obliged, sliding out another sheet. Boxes and arrows, our family name at the top, and beneath it a new rectangle shaded in gray, quantum division. Under that, another box with a title already filled in, Head of Division, Christopher Turner. My breath caught so sharply I tasted metal. Chris? I asked, staring at the page as if the letters might rearrange themselves into sense. He's head? Of course I am, Chris answered, shrugging in a way that told me he'd practiced it in the mirror, casual, inevitable, inherited. Dad says you're the creative type. Vision. But a division needs leadership. Operations. People skills. You know, real-world stuff. Real world. I repeated, nauseated. You're a senior who just dropped your business analytics capstone because you missed the deadline. He rolled his eyes. That's college. And this is business. My father took back control of the moment with a small rap of his knuckles on the table. Focus, he said. The buyer is lined up. The terms are strong. There's a valuation on your thing. He gestured vaguely toward my graphs, and it's better than I predicted. 1.5 billion. We move now, before the market gets crowded. The buyer, I said slowly. Who? You don't need to worry about that, he said. I do the worrying. You sign, we close. The lawyers will paper the rest. I need to know who, I insisted, the room tilting. Is this legal? The patents are. Oh, patents, he said, almost fondly. We've already reviewed all that. This document assigns your rights to Turner's family holdings. From there, we license. Simple. My rights? The words scraped my throat. You can't assign what you don't own. The university is thrilled, he cut in, waving his hand. Universities don't build empires. They farm out ideas. That's what we're doing. Farming it out. Monetizing. Getting real value before your quantum runs out of magic. He reached for his pen, slid it toward me like a dagger smoothed to silver. All that's left is your signature. I stared at the line where my name would go and felt the room narrow to a tunnel. Somewhere behind me, the dishwasher hummed. My mother unfolded a napkin with shaking hands, then refolded it, as if that could fold the moment back into something polite. Mom? I said, because I didn't know who else to appeal to, because I was still someone's daughter, because there had to be one pair of eyes at this table that saw me. She met my gaze for a second, then looked at the contract. Your father knows how to do business, dear, she said softly. He's taken care of us for years. He'll take care of you. That's what this is, my father added, businesslike. I can protect your asset. You're not equipped to negotiate at this level. You did your part, and now we'll do ours. I did my part? I repeated, the words hollow. Years of night labs, of failed runs and recalibrations and notes scribbled with shaking hands, boiled down to I did my part. What about my team? My mentor? The university. We'll send them a fruit basket, Chris joked. My father chuckled, pleased with the tone of the evening again, the deal back on track, his narrative restored. I looked down at the paper labeled internal allocation. There it was, in bland bullet points, 70% of proceeds retained within Turner's family holdings, 30% reserved for the inventor as a founder incentive, dispersed at the board's discretion over a vesting period contingent on continued cooperation. Board's discretion? I asked, my voice thin. Standard, he said. You'll be on a nice salary. Bonuses when appropriate. Your brother will run the day-to-day. You'll do the science stuff. The science stuff, I echoed. In my division. Under my brother. Our division, Chris corrected cheerfully, tapping the org chart. Family business. The irony was so thick I could hardly breathe. The girl who'd been told for years that science was a toy for the poor was now being asked to hand over the toy so the family could sell it for parts. Why are you doing this? I asked finally, though I knew the answer. Money. Control. Legacy, their version of it. But I needed to hear him say it. He considered me as if I were an unfamiliar customer trying to argue about a bar tab. Because this is how adults win, Margaret, he said. You found something. Good for you. Now we turn it into a future for all of us. We scale. We hire. We grow. Your brother learns leadership. You learn to stay in your lane. Everybody wins. And if I don't sign? Chris snorted. My father didn't blink. Don't be dramatic. You will sign. You're not foolish enough to walk away from $1.5 billion. It's not my $1.5 billion if it's yours, I said, surprising myself with how even my tone sounded. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. You're overcomplicating this. We've already spoken to people who matter. Your window is small. Markets move. If you drag your feet, the buyer moves on and your discovery becomes yesterday's news. Then what? You go back to your little lab and your little grants? You could be set for life, Margaret. Your children could be set. Their children. Children. He tossed the word like a chip onto the table, as if my hypothetical future offspring were bargaining tools. I looked down again at the neat lines waiting for ink. I could see every scratch on the table, every tiny air bubble trapped in the varnish. Chris slid the pen closer. Come on, sister, he said lightly. Sign and celebrate. We can open a bottle. Make it official. I'll show you the slide deck I've been working on. You'll love the logo. I closed my eyes for a second, long enough to feel the movement of my own breath, slow and deliberate. When I opened them, nothing at the table had changed. The contract still lay there like a new road someone had paved over my feet. "Don't stress, we're just selling your research," he had said, as if the words came from a law of physics even I couldn't break. Around 2 a.m., the contract lay on my desk, breathing quietly in the dark. I started noticing the seams, names, dates, email addresses glossed over in my father's confident summary. I took photos of the pages with my phone. When the house finally stilled, I padded to the kitchen for water and saw a small black USB drive on the counter by the coffee maker, branded with a sleek silver logo I didn't recognize. I slipped it into my pocket without thinking, the way you pocket a shell from a beach you're not sure you'll ever see again. Another morning came, flat and gray. My father left early for meetings. My mother fussed with dishes that were already clean. Chris yawned theatrically, said he had calls, and disappeared to his room where he never took calls. I made an excuse about needing fresh air and drove to a cafe with stable Wi-Fi. My hands were shaking so badly the barista poured my latte himself. I plugged in the drive. The logo I'd seen in silver bloomed on my screen in crisp black, Next Core Technologies. At first, the name meant nothing. Then, like a lens snapping into focus, headlines from the past year aligned in my mind, Next Core gobbling up robotics firms, buying biomedical analytics teams, rolling out new proprietary models like they were seasonal flavors. They were an AI giant with a public smile and a private appetite, famous for partnerships that always ended with the smaller company's identity swallowed whole. The drive held a neatly curated folder, TQ, Transaction Materials. My heart hammered at those two letters. Inside were drafts of letters of intent, a deck titled Integration Path, Quantum Comms, a compensation schedule, and an email thread that made my throat go dry. The thread began months ago, my father writing from his business account to a Next Core VP of Strategic Growth. The opening line felt like a slap. "We control the inventor." Not my daughter, not our family member, but we control. The rest was worse. He described my research as a domestic asset with dual-use potential, emphasized that time to market depends on swift consolidation of rights, and offered a clean transfer through Turner's family holdings. He promised full cooperation from the inventor. He CC'd no one. And never once used my name. Weeks later, replies arrived from people with titles that hummed with quiet power, corporate development, special projects, national partnerships. They spoke in polished bullets about board alignment, regulatory foresight, containment of academic leakage. One line stood out in a pale highlight, as if someone had tugged it toward my eyes. "We are prepared to extend Mr. Turner an independent board seat post-close, plus a performance-based participation on the take." Post-close. Participation on the take. I opened the compensation schedule. A simple table. 70% of equity proceeds allocated to Turner's family holdings and its designated members, 30% reserved for inventor incentive pool, vesting over 7 years, contingent on ongoing satisfactory collaboration and public brand alignment. There it was, in black and white. My father planned to distribute 70% among the family, a phrase that meant himself first, always, and leave me a controlled slice I would have to earn by behaving. Another deck described governance and succession. A slide titled Leadership Narrative showed 3 photos arranged like a family tree, my father at the top under the word steward, Chris beneath him under the word operator, a blank silhouette on the side under the word inventor. The notes read, "Public story. Visionary inventor supported by stable Midwestern enterprise. Avoid academic industrial conflict frames. Emphasize family continuity. Position brother as integrator." I stared at that blank silhouette until my temples throbbed. They hadn't even bothered to paste my face. I scrolled further and found a draft press release. It called me Margaret Turner, lead technical originator, then pivoted instantly to Turner's Family Holdings Strategic Stewardship and Next Core's global platform. The quotes were already written. My father's was about responsibility and turning ideas into reality. Chris's was about building the next generation of American industry. My quote, written for me, was a cage. I'm grateful to my family for believing in my work. I could feel the words drying my mouth from the inside. I forwarded nothing. I downloaded nothing. I just read, breathing steadily, as if someone were counting for me. The cafe filled with people tapping laptops and laughing quietly at things I would never know. Back at the house, I found my mother in the den folding dish towels that didn't need folding. I sat across from her on the edge of the chair and placed the USB between us like an exhibit. How long have you known? I asked. She flinched, tiny, almost imperceptible. Then she smoothed the towel again, aligning its corners with a care that made my teeth ache. Margaret, we've already discussed this. Your father knows how to do business. Dear, she said, not meeting my eyes. You can't do it alone. But I wasn't alone, and you know it, I said. She looked up briefly, her expression a combination of apology and something like relief at having the line ready. This is bigger than professors. Bigger than a campus. These people, she gestured vaguely toward the air, the world, the logo she'd probably seen on a slide, they know how to protect what you've made. By taking it, I said. By making it safe, she corrected gently, as if I were a child confusing road signs. Chris came in halfway through, pretending surprise at my tone. Whoa, what's with the interrogation vibe? He asked, leaning against the door frame with his hands in his pockets, the picture of casual entitlement. He spotted the USB and smiled without his eyes. You've been doing homework. Next core, I said. When were you going to tell me that the buyer is next core? He shrugged, that practiced little lift of the shoulders he used when the truth didn't fit him. When it mattered? It matters now, I stated. He looked at our mother. She nodded, a small, weary permission. Chris turned back to me with the careful patience of a junior manager explaining policy to a new hire. Look, sis, there's a reason people partner with giants. Infrastructure. Legal. Security. Distribution. We get a seat at the table and a slice of the upside without the growing pains. Dad's on the board post-close huge. We all win. Isn't that wonderful? 70% to the family, I said. And 30 to me if I behave? His smile sharpened. If you collaborate, he corrected. Words matter. Do they? I asked. Words like, we control the inventor? For a second, the smirk slipped. Then he laughed, too loud for the room. You're cherry-picking emails. That's deal talk. Don't be sensitive. You've always been, you know. Sensitive. I stared at him until the color rose in his cheeks. He looked away first. What do you want, Margaret? My mother asked, almost plaintive. To run a company? To fight with lawyers? To spend years in court? You're too good for that. You should be doing your science. While your father can handle the rest. I want ownership of my work, I said. I want consent. I want to be the one who decides what happens to the thing I built. My voice was steady and low. It surprised even me. Chris stepped into the room then, no longer lounging. His eyes were bright, hard little coins. He had always wanted this, wanted a crown that fit without effort, wanted to be introduced as the one who ran things. Dad's giving you a gift, he said. A platform. A legacy. Just don't make this adversarial. A platform. A legacy. Words smelled like bad whiskey. I stood. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too choreographed. You're selling me, I said, not loudly, but in a way that made both of them stop moving. Not my work. Me. My silence, my face on a press release, my cooperation leased and measured and paid out over 7 years if I smile at the right cameras. My mother's eyes glistened. No, we're protecting you, she whispered. We're protecting what you made. By taking my name off it? I asked. By replacing it with the family. She closed her eyes, just for a second, the way people do in church when the words are too much. Family comes first, she said. Chris looked triumphant then, mistaking her loyalty for my surrender. Good, he said briskly. So we're aligned. I'll tell you a secret, Dad's with Next Core this afternoon. He'll share the signed internal transfer tonight. Then we'll. There's nothing signed. I barked. And let the sentence hang in the space between us, not a threat, but a fact. I picked up the USB and closed my fingers around it. It was warm from the laptop's heat, small and undeniably real. I walked to the doorway and paused. My mother's hands were back on the towels, folding and refolding the same square of fabric, the way a person tidies a room while a storm climbs the hill toward the house. Chris's eyes followed the USB like a cat tracking a bird. Despite everything, I left that same evening. I didn't pack properly. I shoved my folder, the USB, and 2 changes of clothes into a carry-on and drove straight to the airport with my heart beating like I'd swallowed a metronome. On the plane, I stared at the sea back in front of me and rehearsed what I would say to Professor Stevens. By midnight, we had turned the lab into a war room. The whiteboard became a map of my work: dates, times, instrument IDs, sample numbers, calibration logs, and the exact parameter sweeps that led to stabilization. I opened my notebooks, the stained, dog-eared stack that still smelled of flux, and flipped to the pages with the earliest sketches. Stevens set up a scanner. Every page I'd ever written on was digitized, tagged, and backed up to 3 separate drives. I pulled purchase histories from my email and card statements, every spool of wire, every photo detector, every cryostat repair kit, every tube of epoxy. We labeled each receipt and attached it to the corresponding experiment. By 2 a.m, the university's general counsel and 2 patent attorneys arrived, bleary-eyed but alert, coffee in hand. They spread out non-disclosure agreements and a checklist that looked like a flight plan. "We are going to file a full patent application," one of them said, voice even. "Not just a provisional. Claims, embodiments, drawings, the whole thing. Tonight." I nodded, throat tight. I began dictating the method while the junior associate typed so fast her bracelets chimed. We worked in shifts. Stevens drafted a technical declaration, the long road of dead ends, the small twist that made the difference, the reproducibility tests we had repeated until our eyes crossed. I diagrammed the apparatus, block by block, then zoomed into each interface to show what mattered: thermal isolation strategies, error correction layering, the feedback loop that kept coherence from collapsing, the room temperature shielding I had improvised with parts no one else thought to combine. Every time I hesitated, Stevens reminded me, "Teach the stranger." It helped. I wrote as if I were explaining it to someone who wanted to believe, but needed proof. The lawyers were relentless in the best way. "Who touched this? When was this parameter first used? Is there lab camera footage?" There was. Security had weeks of time-stamped video, me in that awful gray hoodie, me swapping sensors, me swaying on my feet while a timer blinked. We requested copies and logged hashes for integrity. IT pulled server logs showing my commits to the control software. Our department admin, woken at 3 a.m., emailed purchase orders with grant numbers highlighted. We added them to the appendix. At dawn, I called the machine shop. The foreman, bless him, answered on the second ring. He remembered the day I'd asked him to mill a custom mount with tolerances that made him whistle. "I still got the ticket," he said. 10 minutes later, a scanned copy hit my inbox with the date circled in pen. We stapled it to a photo of the mount installed in the rig, taken weeks before my father ever sent his first email to NextCore. The first draft of the application ran to hundreds of pages. The claims were precise, not just stabilizing entanglement, but exactly how ranges, relationships, the order of operations, the specific feedback law that turned a fragile phenomenon into a usable channel. The attorneys pushed me to choose words that were broad enough to protect the core, but surgical enough to survive examination. "Don't boast," one said. "Just demonstrate." By late afternoon, word reached us through a colleague who knew a colleague inside NextCore. They had filed a patent application that morning. A land grab, our counsel said, jaw tight. We pulled their published summary as soon as it hit the database, thin, almost theatrical in its vagueness. It gestured toward room temperature protocols without naming one. It invoked novel feedback without any math. Read like a press release wearing a lab coat. We gathered in a conference room littered with coffee cups and highlighters. The senior attorney spread our draft and their summary side by side. "Here's the problem," she said. "They're staking territory. If examiners see theirs first, it muddies things." My stomach dropped, then steadied when she tapped our stack. but you have the details. Dates, data, witnesses, chain of custody. If they're vague, they can't claim priority over what they can't describe. So we filed before dusk. The moment I clicked submit and watched the confirmation number populate, my hands started shaking so hard I had to sit down. Stephen squeezed my shoulder, brief and firm. Good, he said. Good. The next 48 hours blurred into depositions and declarations. I swore to timelines under penalty of perjury. Stephen swore to supervision. The shop foreman swore to the day he milled the mount and what we said it was for. The grad student who had borrowed my oscilloscope the week of the breakthrough swore to seeing my setup before and after. Our admin swore to the internal routing of every requisition and to the absence of any external payments with the word Turner on them. We built a fence of facts around the work and locked every gate. When the official notice arrived that next course filing had been accorded a preliminary date hours before ours, our attorney didn't even blink. Dates aren't destiny, he said, tapping our appendix. Disclosure is. He prepared a challenge on the spot, derivation and lack of enablement. He circled their broadest claim with a red pen and simply asked, how? It felt almost childish and exactly right. That evening, we met in a smaller room with thicker walls. Counsel walked us through scenarios, interference, opposition, litigation. They'll push, she warned. They'll send letters that sound like thunder. They'll call administrators who like donations. They'll hint at national security. They'll try to make you small. I nodded, thinking of my father's press-ready quote about responsibility. Smallness was a tactic. And I refused it. The following morning brought the first letter, next core asserting priority and overlapping subject matter, requesting an amicable resolution. Our attorney read it, then placed it gently on the table as if it were a beaker containing something corrosive. He looked around at me, and leaned forward until his knuckles pressed white into the wood. They don't have the details, he said, slamming his fist once, the sound sharp and clean. We have everything. We will win. The room went very quiet, the way a lab does right before the measurement that matters. The notification came early on a Tuesday, an email from the patent office with the subject line I had been imagining in the quiet hours for months. I clicked it and read twice before I let myself breathe. The patent was registered in my name. Mine. The attorneys sent a terse celebratory note, confirmed. Congratulations. And Professor Stevens called without preamble. I could hear the pride in his voice even through the static. For a few minutes we didn't say much. We just let the relief settle like dust after a building stops shaking. The news moved faster than I did. Within days, journalists were poking around the department. Within a week, my inbox was a corridor of open doors. A dozen corporations requested technical briefings. 3 wanted in-person demos. 1 asked for exclusivity and a strategic narrative for their board. I bought a white blazer at a thrift store and learned to say no without apologizing. The first negotiations began exactly 7 days after the patent number stamped itself into my life. The opening figures sounded unreal when people said them out loud, 1 billion, 1.2, 1.5, and then, as more players joined the table, they rose without ceremony to 2 and above. I watched the numbers climb like mercury in August and tried to remember to eat. Our legal team put rails on the road. They insisted on academic attribution in perpetuity, non-negotiable research carve-outs for my lab, export controls counsel in the loop from the first slide, and a governance model that didn't treat science like a vending machine. I insisted on something quieter, but just as vital, that we would not build a product whose only purpose was to make fear more efficient. If a company balked at that line, the meeting ended. People always reveal themselves in the pause. My father tried calling after the first article ran. I let it go to voicemail, then listened once, just to be sure there was nothing inside the sound of his voice that could hook me again. There wasn't. A text followed, as if we were simply ironing out a small misunderstanding. Time to coordinate. Family strategy meeting tonight. 7 p.m. I typed my reply slowly, each word like a step taken over ice I had finally learned would hold. I am no longer your company's project. I am a scientist, and my research belongs to me. I stared at the sentence until it felt like bone and sent it. He didn't respond. Later I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd thrown a tumbler against the garage wall and missed the trash can by inches. Next course circled back with a different tone, polite, then earnest, then almost pious, as if we were all caretakers of a fragile future. They floated numbers that could rearrange a city budget, then asked for little things that were not little, soft vetoes, quiet approvals, control disguised as choreography. Our counsel translated the music into meaning and slid the pages back across the table. "We're not starving," she said calmly. "We're choosing." A week bled into a month of term sheets and diligence rooms. I slept on my couch with the laptop open and alarms set for time zones I had never visited. By the end of the second month, the offers had forked into paths: license the core and keep the soul, or sell a piece of the soul and agree to pretend I hadn't. I chose the road that allowed me to wake up and see my name on the patent without tasting ash. The numbers were still enormous, billion scale, the kind that makes acquaintances start using the word destiny like it's a business term, but the structure let me hold on to the center of the work. It wasn't the largest figure on the table. It was the one I could live with. In the midst of it, my father tried again, this time through my mother. She called during a break between calls and asked if we could talk without lawyers. I said we already were. She inhaled as if a wave had just surprised her knees. "Your father wants to make amends," she said carefully, "the way you carry a cake you know is going to break in the middle. He says we can all still." I stopped her gently. "Mom," I said, "the amends you're imagining are just a different version of the same deal. I'm building something that isn't for sale by people who didn't build it." She didn't even argue. She exhaled, and for the first time I heard fatigue in her voice that had nothing to do with me. The day the first agreement closed, I went back to the lab alone. No champagne. No posts. I turned on the bench light and ran my fingers over the nicked edge where I had once caught my ring and thought I'd broken a finger. I whispered thank you to the room that had held me steady when I had nothing else. 6 months later, I signed a lease on a low building in San Diego with skylights like cautious eyes. I registered a name that felt both accurate and defiant: Turner Quantum Systems. I kept Turner because it was mine too, even if it tasted different in my mouth than it had when I was a child. I hired a photonics engineer who could coax light into behaving like it liked us, a cryptographer with a poet's patience, a software lead who spoke fluent hardware, an operations chief who had seen 3 startups survive adolescence and 1 die for a reason she vowed never to repeat, a compliance counsel who believed ethics isn't a department but an atmosphere. I called 2 former lab mates and told them I needed stubborn people who could learn fast and laugh when the rig misbehaved. They arrived with sleep in their eyes and notebooks full of good questions. We furnished the place like people who planned to stay: workbenches that didn't wobble, chairs that didn't punish backs, a coffee machine that could survive a siege, a whiteboard wall we christened with a list titled simply "Things That Might Work." On day 1 we wrote 3 columns: secure medical data links, satellite ground handshake demo, and post-quantum key distribution for real-world networks without fairy dust. I learned to be a CEO the way I had learned to be a scientist: by staying, by listening, by admitting what I didn't know before it turned into a crater. I set a weekly rule. One day contained entirely of conversations with people who would tell me the truth even if it scraped me. I refused to build a company that confused exhaustion with virtue. We shipped our first internal prototype in month 4, 2 boxes that looked like audio equipment had married a telescope and produced twins. They whispered to each other in a language that would have made my 9th grade self cry from joy. A hospital in La Jolla agreed to be our first pilot for protected data sync. We didn't promise miracles. We promised a better lock. And we kept our promise. When the system held through a real-world outage and recovered exactly the way we said it would, the lead clinician sent us a 1-line email: "You made the right thing." After it, investors came, some because of the patent, some because of the headlines, a few because someone they trusted had told them we were not pretending. I kept the cap table clean and the board small enough to fit around a table I could afford. When someone suggested my father would be a savvy addition, given his operating experience, I smiled in a way that made the suggestion evaporate. He and the rest of my family kept their money. They kept the bars and the houses and the stories they told at dinners I no longer attended about how they had raised a daughter who did something with science. They kept the version where they had always believed in me. I didn't argue with strangers about my own past. I poured myself into circuits and code and the stubborn, daily work of making a fragile thing hold. But they lost the most important thing, my trust. It didn't disappear in one moment. It eroded, layer by layer, until one day I realized there was nothing left to hand them. Trust is a technology too, I think now. It's built by repeated proofs, by consistency under stress, by the absence of hidden clauses. In that sense, my family had shipped vaporware for years, and I had finally stopped clicking update. On certain evenings, I switch off the bench lights one by one and listen for the soft tick of things cooling. I lock the door and step into the San Diego dusk. I don't look back to see if anyone is watching from a window that isn't there. I walk to my car and think about what we'll try tomorrow. My company's name is on the lease. My hands are on the work. That is the story now, and I get to tell it. For years, I tried to earn their recognition, to twist myself into someone worthy of their approval. I thought if I studied harder, worked longer, or reached a higher academic peak, they would finally see me as more than just the daughter who didn't fit the family business. But I was wrong. The more I achieved, the more they plotted to take it from me. That night, when my father laid down that contract, it was not just a legal trick, it was a declaration that he never saw me as his daughter, only as an asset. That realization hurt more than anything. Yet, in that pain, something inside me changed. Self-respect is the only foundation that cannot be taken away. Once I chose it, everything else became easier. Walking away was no longer frightening, it was freedom. And when the patent was registered in my name, it was not just a victory in science, it was proof that my future belonged only to me. If you are watching this now, maybe you've had a father, mother, sibling, or even a spouse try to take credit for your work, diminish your value, or pressure you into giving up something that was rightfully yours. Did you give in, or did you fight back? Did you sacrifice your own dignity to keep the family peace, or did you choose yourself, even at the cost of breaking those bonds? Share your own story in the comments below, I want to hear it. And please, don't forget to hit like and subscribe button if you want to hear more raw, true stories of family, betrayal, and resilience.